right, start the recording. All right, let's see, we got 91% of people have voted on the poll. Wow, 30% have not seen the first session yet.
Oh.
So we have quite a few new people. This is great. So after we're done with this session, we'll make sure to send the recording of this one as well as the first one. So for the third session, hopefully you'll come attend that as well, and you'll have seen the first two. Okay, so Cindy, were you able to send out the invite to the others? Okay, awesome, thank you.
I was.
All right, and Sharon, is your mic working? Let's test it out. Still no? Let's see, you're muted now. No, still not. All right. Okay, well, we are at 5 after 10, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see what Sharon, oh, okay, someone's on the way to help Sharon. We have some technical difficulties with the mic, of course. This is how it goes with webinars. So happy that we have Allison here to start. So we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. If you're just now joining, just a reminder that you're not going to be able to see yourself as an attendee or hear you. But if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand or post it in the chat. And then we can answer those questions during the training or at the very end for our Q&A. Okay, so let's get started. My name is Michaela Tracy. I work in the APSS program at Children's Bureau. And we are excited to have you all for our second session of our 7 core issues training series. Today, we'll be talking about birth and first parents and the impact of the 7 core issues on these members of the constellation. So often we work with these families either directly or indirectly, and we don't realize how the 7 core issues come to play with birth and first parents. So this is going to be very interesting for us. But before we get started, I'd like to just make sure that we are good to go with sharing the screen. Allison, are you able to share the screen on here?
Yes, I can. Are you ready for me to pull up the PowerPoint, Michaela?
Yeah, why don't you get that started? And then while you're doing that, I just want to introduce you today, since we do have, it looks like, a good amount of people, 28% who have not seen the first session. So for those of you who weren't here for the first one, I'll just introduce really quickly. Our trainers today are Sharon, Roszia, and Allison Davis Maxon. And we are so fortunate to have them with us to present this material because they are the authors of the 7 core issues book. They're nationally recognized experts in the field of child welfare, and Sharon actually helped develop the framework of the 7 core issues back in 1988. So welcome again, Sharon and Allison. We are excited to have you here with us again. And then if you are ready to get started, I will go ahead and pass it to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Cindy. That was quite adorable. We appreciate that shameless plug around the core issues in the book. Welcome, everyone. Just thank you to Children's Bureau and Cindy, who's an old colleague and friend. I didn't mean old, Cindy, you know what I mean. And Michaela, for all your work behind the scenes. We are just blessed and happy to be here. We were just talking this morning about how excited we are that we have so many people signed up for a webinar like this around our birth first parent and family experience. They have been really just far too long ignored in the shadows. We've not customized resources and supported their grief and loss experience. So I'm so happy you all are here. If I could hug and kiss all of you, I would hug and kiss all of you. And I know Sharon feels the same. So I'm going to be holding this morning section. I know there's about 30% of you that didn't see the first. This is really a series of webinars, and they really are linked. So if you're just jumping into this one's the second in a series. And I say that because we did a pretty deep dive in the first session on the core issues and really framing the core issues for all members of the constellation. So really would encourage you to go back. I'm going to do a bit of a lighter touch on the core issues this morning, more framing it around the birth first parent and family, extended family experience. And then Sharon is going to pick up and do a much deeper dive, really where the rubber meets the road, and give some tools and some really experiential ways to understand the interior of that experience. So with that said, again, we are very excited to be here and with all of you, and really thank you for your desire to, or your ability to be here with us, and your desire to learn more and try to understand and have sensitivity and awareness around the birth first parent experience. Sharon and I spent about 2 years researching, writing, editing, and putting all the bones on the core issues, which is about 450 pages of a pretty, again, a comprehensive dive into the experience of constellation members over the lifespan. So when we talk about the adoption or permanency experience for all members of the constellation, and I'll just help frame that term when we use it, that anyone immediately touched by this experience. So think about our kin families, our grand families right now. Here in the US, most of our child welfare systems are shifting into a kin first system. So kin placements and grand families are growing exponentially. And while that minimizes losses over time for the child, it doesn't erase the losses. So we're going to be framing some of these issues around our kin family experiences as well. Constellation members include our birth first parents, which is really what we're going to be speaking about today. It also includes the child and the teen and the adult adoptee, which is what we focused on in session 1, a real deep dive around the core issues over the lifespan for the child, teen, and adult adoptee. The constellation also includes our resource parents, our foster parents, our kinship parents, our relative caregivers, and our adoptive parents. So you can see that, you know, there is a diversity of perspective around members of the constellation. As we move into today, the goal of the core issues was really to create a roadmap, which is hence why you see this visual. Lots of times folks coming into this experience, whether they're birth first parents or grandparents or kin families or foster families, there's often no roadmap for all of the issues and barriers and complexities that they move into. And I want to frame most of us, whether you're a professional or a parent, most of us connected to foster care and child welfare or kin care. You know, child welfare is often this silo, which you'd imagine it's kind of like this big silo, but there are many other silos that impact the families we're serving, and specifically the families we're going to talk about today. So as we begin our talk and conversation today, know that Sharon and I are going to be saving the last 15 to 20 minutes around Q&A and really inviting some of your questions. But as we begin this conversation today, we really want to gently ask folks to lean into some discomfort as we acknowledge that we are all in a process of really significant change. If you look at the significant cultural change, not just due to the pandemic, I want us to kind of think about all the social justice issues that have been coming to a head that are really all in our conversations every day. That this significant change and all the distress that we see, we're really in this opportunity for a metamorphosis in our society. And that I hope we offer ourselves, Sharon and I often speak about this, we hope we offer ourselves kind of grace as we grow, that we'll all make mistakes in our learning. So from language, you'll hear Sharon and I speak really specifically about language and myths and stereotypes, that words matter, but that we're growing and the systems we work within need to evolve and grow. That still some of our practices are based on old myths and stereotypes and old practices that really need to be evolved. And we want to invite deeper and more truthful conversations as we learn to honor and respect each other and our diverse perspectives. One of my favorite mantras from Virginia Satir, who's really the kind of the mother of family therapy. And she said, we come together in our similarities, but we grow through our differences, that we really have the most to learn from folks that are very different from us. And with that said, much of the time, especially now due to the very significant social justice issues that are deeply impacting children and families, due to historical oppression, trauma, that these social justice issues disproportionately impact our Indigenous and tribal communities and our families of color. And these include poverty, systemic racism, oppression, disproportionate resources and accessibility within all of our systems. So even though child welfare is one silo, I'd have us think about healthcare and access to healthcare, which includes prenatal healthcare, which is going to link us to our birth first parent experience, which includes access to substance dependency treatment. Think about our educational systems, our mental health systems, our court and legal systems, our juvenile justice systems, that all of the systemic oppression and intergenerational oppression deeply impacts the most vulnerable families in our communities. And most of us are on the front lines of serving and advocating for those communities. So you'll hear Sharon and I work hard to bring in lived voices. I am not a birth first parent. So we work to bring in, as we did with our book, lived voices from those communities. So it's why you may hear a segue to a poem that captures the essence of one of the core issues we may be talking about. So for members of the constellation that might be here with us today, we want to work to include lived voices and lived experiences. That one of our mantras that we learn from folks that are connected to the constellation with lived experience is that, especially from our youth, like our youth that either grew up in foster care and are emancipating from our residential treatment centers or from systems without permanency, that when you do something for me without me, you're doing something to me. That inclusion is critical at every turn in this road to get to the change that's needed. So you'll hear Sharon and I speak more to that, but I just wanted to lay some of that groundwork as we move into the core issues. So a brief history really of child welfare, and this is going to be the briefest brief of brief. Because again, we did this in series 1, but when we think about the history of child welfare and foster care, we have to talk about our history because it's why we're still stuck on some of the language, the framing, the phrases we use, the practices, some of our practices currently. Think about sealed records, for instance. The sealing of the original birth certificate, a very old and outdated practice that still impacts members of the constellation in really significant life-altering ways. So some of our practices that came about that actually predate foster care adoptions, these practices came from private baby adoption practice 30, 40 years ago. Some of our very outdated practices are still quite alive and well. So it's important for us to know the history that we're entrenched in, because many of the myths around our birth first parent community are connected to these old practices and stereotypes. So I'd have you think for a minute, when I say birth first parent, what comes to mind? What is the person on the street? If we were interviewing 10 people on the street, if you say, hey, what's a birth first parent? Do you know any birth first parents? What do you think about? What would they say? That those myths and stereotypes are alive and well. And they come from largely our history in child welfare and the practice of adoption, of secrecy and shame, what we call the 2 S's. That this shroud of secrecy has been very shaming for our birth first parent community. So you may have met many birth first parents and not know you met them because they're not going to tell you that they're birth first parents, right? So in our book, one of the things that we wanted to especially catch up, and you see that we took the old adoption triad, which you just saw on the previous slide, and we want to be able to speak to how attachment is always impacted when foster care and adoption is in play, that trauma and traumatic losses are always in play, and that the core issues, the bottom of the triangle, are intergenerational and across the lifespan. So even for children that are adopted at birth, that these core issues unfold developmentally over time. For our birth first parent, often living in the veil of secrecy and shame, it's where healing tends to be challenged because we cannot heal what we're not acknowledging. So when the culture generally outside in, generally what the birth first parent experiences is shame or stigma. I'm a birth parent, what is that? That sounds negative. That sounds something to be ashamed of. I'm not telling people I'm that. So when you think about the traumatic losses and how those either get grieved and mourned or don't, because grieving when it becomes stuck can become pathological internally. I'm not grieving. I'm in a constant state of mourning or distress or self-loathing. I'm not supported in my grief. So these are not just issues that occur inside the mind and the body of the birth first parent, but there's a cultural context to this. So us being, especially those of us in the professional or constellation community, working in relationship with our birth first parents, it's so important to be aware of how these issues and complexities play out over the lifespan for our birth first parents. So here is the new wheel that Sharon and I created inside the core issues, and you can see that loss. And I want you to kind of think about, Sharon's going to do a deeper dive into the losses, that these are traumatic losses. These aren't losses like, oh, I got a divorce or I lost my job, or not kind of smaller losses. This traumatic loss, the loss of a child that I created, the loss of my parental identity and my parental role with this child, and all the micro losses embedded in that, change the trajectory of my life. It changes who I am, changes how I feel about myself. These are traumatic losses that have a profound impact on how I may view myself, and then how I am able to move into emotional intimacy and relationships with other people, maybe even subsequently other children that I give birth to and parent. So these traumatic losses can lead to feelings of rejection and or fears of rejection, which is why I may not tell anyone. The feelings of shame and or guilt, and then the grief process, and whether I get stuck in that grief and mourning process. Identity formation. What is this thing called a birth first parent? How do I incorporate that into my self-identity, how I view myself? Intimacy, think attachment and emotional intimacy, which Sharon's going to speak to, and then mastery and control. How do I get to this place of mastery around this profound loss and how it impacted me? When we view the experience of adoption, it really is about the disassembling and reassembling of family and the profound impact it has across really 16 familial trees. That we tend to think it's about, a birth parent and an adoptive parent and a child. We tend to have a pretty linear view of the impact. But the culture generally outside of this experience, those that aren't connected to the child welfare adoption community, generally view adoption kind of like this, pretty simply or narrowly. And they view adopted kids as lucky. Often there's two different views of birth first parents. One, like, they were wonderful to give their children away to somebody that was going to take good care of them. The other side of that is, how could you give up a child, or how could you not get sober for your child, or how could you not work harder for your child? So there's often this pendulum swing back and forth around how the outside culture views our birth first parents. The losses that are really profound, when we talk about them being experienced over the lifetime, I want us, especially those of you that are professionals with us, how do we support these losses that are impactful and profound over the lifespan of our birth first parents? How do we support them? And by the way, what we're learning is many of our birth first parents that are losing their children in child welfare are the very same children that we raised as a system. Many of the parents that we're now, quote, taking or removing their children are children that grew up in foster care. The last year I worked with 2 birth parents that found me, birth mothers, both of whom were adopted from foster care, had ongoing challenges connected to a tremendous amount of trauma. Think high ACEs, think early in utero exposure, years in the foster care system, multiple attachment disruptions, a lot of internalized trauma, and then fear when they went into parenting around, how am I going to be able to parent when I don't feel I was parented well, or that my needs were met, that my attachment and developmental needs weren't met. So I have a lot of fears around my own ability to parent a child. When we talk about the losses, one of the things Sharon and I spend a lot of time doing is really helping to frame what we call traumatic losses. And traumatic losses show up in different ways connected to the birth first parent experience. Vicarious losses are those losses that are embedded in our sensory system that are outside of awareness. So think about being with a crisis pregnancy. If I'm using substances, or I'm in an unhealthy, abusive relationship where I'm being traumatized, and many of my experiences of trauma are connected to being pregnant, giving birth, losing the child. That's all embedded within my sensory system, within my bodily state, outside of conscious awareness. So trauma triggers for me around this birth first parent experience could be seeing a baby or hearing a baby cry, that for other people might trigger warmth and a loving response. Those may trigger vicarious traumatic responses from my body and sensory system. Ambiguous losses are all over the birth first parent experience. Ambiguous losses are those losses where there's no closure. For our birth first parent community, it can feel like what we call a living death. Like I'm going to lose this child forever, the child that I created and gave birth to and or parented for a number of years, if I was a first parent. The ambiguous losses, to me, it feels like my child dies to me because I lose them, but my child's not dead. How do I grieve an ambiguous loss where there's no closure? And a loss that maybe the culture or my own family or the people that support me don't support my grief, may not see my grief. In fact, they may blame me for their losses. So for example, if my mother, because I lost this child, she lost her grandchild. So she's really angry and distressed at me for her loss experience. So you can see that many of these losses don't get grieved. And then there are secondary losses on top of that. These are all the losses that show up every day. So if I lost my child 5 years ago and I know they're in kindergarten and I see a bunch of kindergartners, I might go, oh, my child is in kindergarten now. Are they happy? Are they being loved? Are they learning? Are they alive? I have all these questions connected to all these secondary losses. The rejection for our birth first parent and extended family. I want us to always also be thinking about the extended birth first family, relatives, grandparents, aunts and uncles that lose nieces and nephews. That it can feel like a rejection from the court system, the child welfare system, that I can feel and then incorporate this sense of rejection, like maybe I don't deserve anything good to happen to me. that this sense of rejection can show up in many ways where I fear rejection, which is why I may not tell anyone. I may not tell a living soul. Many of our birth first parents can get remarried, have other kids, and then not tell husband or subsequent kids that they lost a child, either through relinquishment or through the child welfare system. The experience of shame or guilt that grows out of this primal loss, the traumatic loss, that we really do want to think about the distinct difference between shame, which is an experience of internal self-loathing, that I am bad. There's something wrong or damaged or broken. That's me. Allison is broken or bad or damaged. It's a self-loathing. Guilt is more adaptive and generally about a behavior. I feel guilty because I stole the candy bar when I was 6 years old. Like, we learned guilt. In fact, cultures and parents use guilt all the time to teach right from wrong. But shame is a very different experience. And many of our birth first parents have deeply embedded shame identities, a narrative that is self-loathing, that I don't deserve to live. I don't deserve to parent. I don't deserve to have a connection to this beautiful, amazing child that I created, that if I feel so self-loathing about myself, I may not feel I even deserve to have a relationship with this child. This can manifest in all kinds of suffering, which is where oftentimes the addiction to substances plays out. The more pain and self-loathing I have, the more propensity I have to want to numb from this experience, right? Which is why we may see our birth first parents fall into a deeper cycle of their addiction after relinquishment, right? And then the cycle continues, and we may be taking another child from them, removing another child. Grief is really where the work is. And that often for our birth first parent community, it's often when we let them go, when we go, okay, we're going to 2-6 hearing, we're done, no more services, now you're on your own. And what they're on their own with is so much grief, loss, there's a traumatic loss that might go unhealed over the lifespan. And that there really is a process connected to this. One of the first persons to really explore this process was Sir John Bolby, who actually studied just the traumatic experience of losing a child. For him, it was connected to parents whose children get diagnosed with a terminal illness. But the process is really similar for our birth first parent community when they're being told you're going to lose your child, or the 2-6 hearing, now you're going to lose the child. We're going to sever your rights to this child. That what Bolby found was initially parents go through a numbing, a sense of denial. This is not happening. This is not happening. I'm going to create an alternate narrative around this. You are not taking my child. In fact, they can create an alternate kind of narrative and be angry at the person that's giving them the news, i.e. the social worker or the court system, or you're lying, or you're making this up, or you're be angry at the deliverer of the news. Then the mourning, the anticipatory grief, and the letting go into self-loathing, which is often where our parents, our birth first parent community, can stay in unmourned grief, which can become pathological, embedded in their sensory system. Think body, emotion, and mind state, often without the supports that are needed for them to really heal. Because grieving, the mourning process, and by the way, we're a culture that doesn't grieve well. Sharon and I really did a deep dive into grief in our book, but it requires remembering, it requires feeling. We have to actually feel the emotion connected to this process. And if I don't want to feel, I stay numbed. I might stay addicted. And often when our parents begin to sober up, when they get into recovery, what surfaces is all the traumatic loss and the core issues. So they need our support more during that process. So I'm going to move more quickly through these because I have to be handing it to my partner in crime. But you can see that this is often a very disorienting process and experience, where you may see extreme highs and lows and internal disorganization with our birth first parent population, who may disconnect, by the way, from quote services, especially services that don't come from their community. And one of the things that Sharon and I are always passionate about is making sure that our parents have peers, have folks that have lived experience, that can walk along this journey with them and support them in a way that only people with lived experience really can. Otherwise, we're kind of outside in that experience. And Sharon and I spoke to that with our notes to professionals at the back of each chapter in our book. Identity, about the storytelling. Our birth first parents need to tell their story. They need to own their story and own their lane. They have value to add. They created a child. They're genetically connected to this child forever. So to think about that role, to be able to claim that role and to do the healing necessary, to see their own value, if there's openness in the relationship, to see their value add to both the child and the adoptive family or the kin family, that I have value to this child and the other constellation members. That identity, there's a tremendous ability for healing that can take place with support.
Allison, you're doing great. You don't have to rush. I'll jump in when you're done.
I love that you have your sound, my friend. That identity, our identity, I want you to think about in terms of our birth first parent community, that this is a role they never planned for, they didn't ask for. Oftentimes it stems from a crisis pregnancy or an unplanned pregnancy, that it wasn't something they went, hey, let me work hard to become this thing called a birth first parent. That this is often this unplanned role, this crisis role. And how do I get support from others that aren't going to shame or stigmatize this role so I can incorporate it into my self identity in a healthy way, in a way where I see that I have value both to myself and to this child. If I don't know who I am and I don't value that role, meaning my lane as a birth first parent, my own self-loathing and shame that I bring to this experience can create intimacy barriers, think attachment, that I may have numbed from my own emotion. If I'm not connected to my own grief and my own affect, it really may disconnect me from myself. I have parts of myself that I loathe or I feel ashamed of. That I may struggle with being able to claim all the parts of myself, and I'm stuck in a constant state of pathological mourning. That if I can't acknowledge and heal from this, intimacy requires emotion. Think about the emotional intimacy of being in healthy, loving relationships with partners, with best friends, with significant others. It requires emotion. So our birth first parents may be living in a very disconnected, lonely, dark place, not feeling deeply emotionally connected to others. And as Sharon goes into attachment, what you're really going to be hearing is that we're actually wired to get our needs met through emotional intimacy, through other humans, through human connectedness. So if I'm living in chronic isolation and pain and or inauthenticity because I feel judged or criticized or loathed or not valued because of this one role that I may have connected to self, it creates barriers for emotional healing and intimacy. And in order for me to heal from this, I need emotionally intimate connections that are safe, that are compassionate, that are respectful, that allow me to tell my truth and my story in a way that doesn't feel judged. So it might be often that professionals, either social workers or therapists, or our parents, our foster or kin or adoptive parents that are in relationship with our birth parents, can offer these spaces for truth telling, for validating their story, which is often connected even before the experience of a birth parent, connected to their own history of trauma and or neglect or attachment disruptions or early victimization. The experience in the core issue of mastery and control. And I'd have us really think about mastery and control on a continuum, with control being at one of the far end and mastery being at the other end. That what can happen is that our birth first parent community, who lose so much control over making decisions, how decisions are going to get made, that they're often in a power down position, not just in this moment in time, but often through a childhood experience of high ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, where there was neglect and poverty and child trauma and addiction and lots of things that were very debilitating around their ability to really own and claim and feel they have the power to make good decisions for themselves. That if they feel a lack of control or power, i.e. helplessness that has been internalized, that then having a system move in or feeling like other people are making this decision for me, that it doesn't feel like I have the power and ability to make decisions. I'm either being influenced by others, or I'm struggling with this ability to find a sense of peace and mastery around this decision. And maybe this decision, if I'm a birth first parent, was really connected to, did I feel not just able to be the kind of parent I wanted to be? Was I able in this moment in time, whatever this moment in time is for me, I might be young or struggling with addiction or having unhealed trauma or mental illness or whatever the impact that I'm having internally, whatever those complexities are, am I able to parent at this moment in time? And does that mean I have to lose the entire connection to my child? Do I still have a role? Can I still have a role with my child, a value add role? And this is where openness and keeping kids connected is so important for all members of the constellation, and can provide a deeper sense of mastery around some of these issues, because I'm not in a constant state of not knowing, which is often the challenge for our birth first parent. I don't even know if my child's living. Are they being loved? What do they look like? I don't know what they look like. Are they happy? Are they playful? I don't even know their personality. Like, I don't see them. I'm not in knowing of them. So it's hard to grieve unacknowledged losses. So often their mastery is stunted. So mastery and the steps to mastery, because I lost so much control. Imagine if our birth first parents feel they have little or no control, because there's judges and social workers and therapists and other parents, and there's everyone that seems to have a lot of control over my life and my decisions and my ability to get to mastery around myself and even some of my own traumatic issues connected to this outcome of me relinquishing this child or losing this child. So who's driving my car, making these decisions? Where is this going? And when the 2-6 occurs and you go, okay, we're done, you're going to lose the rights to your child. Does it mean I have to lose a relationship with the child ongoingly, that I can't shift into a different role? If I can't be the everyday parent, which I understand, can I be a birth first parent and be in the role of having an open connection to the new family and my child as it moves into that new family? That is, there's still a role that I can have that other family members and the culture and community value. That these steps to mastery, by the way, these steps to mastery, we really wrote for all members of the constellation. But as you think about them here, for our birth first parent and extended family, we often experience that it's our birth first parents that have the fewest number of really resources post 2-6 hearing. So not supported in the ongoing traumatic grief and loss that occurs, that is life altering. So we have many of our birth first parents that we call kind of the walking wounded, that it's like they have a gunshot wound to their heart, like their heart's been blown open. But it's a gunshot wound to the heart that doesn't get acknowledged. People don't see it. You know, I feel it, but other people outside in don't see it, don't talk about it, don't acknowledge it. It's the secrecy and shame of, I feel so much pain and suffering connected to this traumatic loss that goes unacknowledged. So I'm going to segue and hand off to my partner, and I know she's there because I could hear her. So I'm going to stop sharing so my partner can share.
Hi, everybody. Well, that didn't work.
I see it right there, Sharon, under PowerPoint. You see the pink, you go into the red where it's lit up. You can tell it's there. Yeah, there it is.
Thank
Sharon,
you.
while you do that, I'm gonna go ahead and start the poll so people can fill that out. So we're gonna have our
Thank you.
second one. Oh, I just shared the results from the first one. Okay, here you go. Sharon and Allison, can you see the results of the poll?
No.
I'm trying to gain access to moving my. There we go. So you're going to have to tell me what the poll has to say.
Okay, I'll share it with everyone. We have 73% who have voted so far. So it has about 30 seconds left. So the question is, do you work with first parents? And it looks like so far it's about 50-50, yes and no.
Wow. I didn't expect that. That's very exciting.
What were you expecting?
I expected that most people were saying that they kind of worked indirectly with the birth first family and had to interpret behaviors and feelings, etc., to the prospective or adoptive or foster or relative caregiving families. So I love that we're 50-50 and that many of you are doing this work directly. That's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But it is relevant to all of our work because no matter what part of the constellation we're touching, we're always interpreting other members of the constellation to the people who are before us. Because remember, we're all in this boat together, and what happens to one rocks the boat for others. Gee, this is a great poll. Thank you so much, Michaela, for doing that. I want to share with you something I don't normally share and why this feels so, I have such a passion for the birth first family. It's not a matter of comparing one person's core issues with another's in the constellation, but it's recognizing that these are often adults or young adults or old adults who didn't have any power or control or any kinds of skills coming into this experience of becoming separated from their children. And so they're extremely vulnerable population. And I want to say that my passion for them started at the very beginning of my career. When I started out for Maricopa County in Phoenix, Arizona, working in adoption, I was in my 20s. And one of the first things I noticed was that there were no services for who we were working with at that point in a county agency, which were crisis pregnancy, largely teens to about age 22, 23, who were living in maternity homes. And they really had no place to go for a real opportunity to talk about what they were experiencing. And I remember I broke all the rules and I brought a whole group of them together at my family home in the backyard by the pool for a barbecue. And it was most amazing to me to watch how much they could open up and talk about what this experience meant for them. And there are still many birth first parents that I worked with over my career who still stay in touch with me. I've had the privilege of watching their life unfold. And for many of them, I became a healthy parent, somebody who could nurture them along the way and help them become the successes that they've been able to become over time. So I have a real passion for this. I also came into the field at a time where we weren't talking about fathers at all. It was before fathers had any rights. It was almost as if the children who were coming into the world got all their genetics from their birth first mothers, and the fathers didn't count. Often we just ignored them totally in the early years of my career. And so it's a real passion of mine, always has been a passion of mine. I also experienced what it was like to relinquish a child. We adopted children when they were toddlers, and one of those children desperately, as an adolescent, became terribly depressed, tried to commit suicide, and then begged to be readopted by her maternal grandparents. And it was such a strong request. And we actually thought about it for a long time, decided that we would have to switch roles. They would have to become the parents, and we would have to become, if you will, the birth first parents. So we went to Los Angeles County, and we sat in this room that had two doors and a door behind us. So we came in the door behind us, we sat at a desk, the social worker was on the other side of the desk, and on either side of her were doors. And believe it or not, during this session, other people walked in through those doors and walked behind her. It was as if this was not an important moment in our lives. It was just a piece of paper to sign. It felt very public. And the answer was, you're doing a great thing. You're doing a great thing. This will be great for her. God bless you for doing the right thing. No discussion about our feelings, what this meant. It was the most destructive and shaming experience, something I don't know that I've ever really moved through. So I also have deep feelings for how these things unfold for our clients. So I bring that to you at the end of my career, thinking that maybe recognizing how long this shaming has been going on and how it even can impact families who disrupt in an adoption, what it means to them about how that unfolds when they, in some sense, relive a birth first parent experience. I hope that's meaningful to all of you. I want to remind you that the losses that we're talking about are profound. They're profound. They change who we are at our very core. They change the direction of our life. And the folks that we are serving, either indirectly by interpreting them to others or directly, carry so much with them into this crisis. So many have in utero exposure and trauma, as Allison mentioned. They have genetic issues and intergenerational trauma from many of the communities that they represent. They have multiple childhood traumas. Many of them grew up in foster care. Some of them were placed for adoption and it wasn't a good match. They didn't have a good experience. They may have experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, substance abuse, violence. They may come with mental health issues. They have attachment impairments, which we're going to talk about, and talk about how that's impacted their relationship with their children. They have been a victim of or witnessed domestic violence. Many come from a life of poverty, and I'm talking about physical poverty, homelessness, lack of transportation, lack of access to what they deserve as human beings, lack of food, lack of clothing, lack of education, lack of fair education, lack of emotional needs being met, which is an emotional poverty, lack of positive parenting role models. You know, we learn to parent at our parents' feet. Many of our individuals never had the privilege of learning good parenting. And the problem is that we carry what we learned at our parents' feet into our parenting, even if we say we would never do it that way. Under stress, out comes our parents' words and our parents' actions. So if there is history of abuse, it gets repeated. And developmental impairments. So if they didn't, and we're going to talk about this with attachment, but if they didn't get an opportunity to learn regulation, if they can't access their prefrontal cortex and think things through clearly, if they don't have a deep understanding of cause and effect, they are already impaired when they carry the crisis that brings them to our attention. Many of them have been incarcerated, so they have prison experiences. Many had absent parents altogether. Many of them moved a lot because of poverty, because of an unstable lifestyle, and it gives them episodic lives. They don't have a full and complete story or an understanding of their story. And I think we need to look at the individuals that we're serving and look at the load that they are carrying into this important aspect of being able to parent or not be able to parent the children that they've brought into the world. It doesn't mean they don't love them. And so many of them are living alone in the world. So they've not had their buckets filled, as Allison would say. They haven't got their buckets filled. And the issue here is that they're drawing from an empty well. They're drawing from an empty well. They don't have the skills needed to meet the requirements that the social services agencies and the courts put before them in order for them to continue to parent their children. They come to us in crisis, and they already now have added trauma because of their court involvement. This is not a problem that they can solve. This isn't a problem-solving event for them. They do not believe that they're going to lose their children. They do not believe they're going to lose their children until the day they do. And then we cast them out into the world without the supports that they need, as Allison mentioned, for healing. Allison has this wonderful way of talking about attachment, and I watched her do this recently in a training, and I thought, now, Allison, that's brilliant. Because she talks about love being this right in here. Attachment is this. It means everything. It means everything to how we develop, how we evolve. Our birth first parents probably do love their children, but they haven't got attachment skills that they can teach to their children. Such an important concept. We have this tremendous need to attach, this tremendous need to attach. So what happens if we don't have those strong attachments is it impacts how we perceive ourselves, everybody else in the world. Are they enemies? Are they supporters? Are they kind? Can I trust them? Have I got any value? And is the world even a safe place? So without attachment, all of those aspects of our points of view, the glasses through which we see the world, are impacted. It is the most important aspect of a child's developmental potential. Children either get their potentials maximized or minimized. So many of our birth first parents miss this. Their potentials have not been maximized. Every species teaches attachment to its young so that they can develop to be the best of their species as they go through life. Well, what happens if they didn't have parents that helped them to regulate? Didn't help them to regulate. Didn't bring them up with joy and happiness and connection, and couldn't down-regulate when they were upset. And I know we talked about this in relation to the children last time. I want you to think about that this isn't a skill that many of our birth first parents have. Their joy may come from drinking. Their joy may come from sex. Their joy may come from being kind of wild in the world. But they don't know how to calm themselves without their substances. Their buckets have not been filled. And you know, it only takes one really good, committed, long-term person, adult, to do this job. Think about how sad it is that we have so many birth first parents that didn't even have one consistent, loving person in their life to do this. So many are living in a survival state. Can they get enough food? Where will they sleep tonight? Will they be safe on the street? They're highly emotional individuals. So this is just to remind you, I'm not going to get deeply into ACEs, but I want you to notice again how high, given all those triangles I showed you to begin with, think about how high our birth first parent ACEs scores would be, how at risk they are from their addictions, for death, for suicide, because they carry so much of their lacking, their poverty of every sort from their childhood into their adulthood, and we expected them to be able to parent. They need to be nurtured so they can nurture their youngsters. Just a reminder of the scores. I think it's worth looking at over and over again. Literally, their development is upside down. Their cognition is the last thing that's present for them. Survival is the basis of their life. So we talked last time about the child's losses. And I want to just say for a minute here that the losses for the birth first parent are often more than they can bear. Often more than they can bear. They've lost their child, which is a part of themselves. All of you witnessing this presentation who are parents Imagine losing a part of yourself, or maybe some of you have during fertility treatments or adoptions that didn't get completed. Maybe there's family strife between you and a grown child. But imagine losing a part of yourself, of your heart, of your being, of a reflection of yourself. Your role, as we talked about last time, there are three kinds of parents. There's legal parents, parenting parents, and genetic parents. They're all different. Normally, we grew up with people who were all three. Normally, as parents who give birth to our children, we are the legal parents and the parenting parents. But they've lost their role as the legal parent. They've lost their role as the parenting parent. They are not there every day. If they watch somebody hold a child's hand crossing the street, they have to wonder, is somebody holding my child's hand crossing the street? Is my child safe? Is my child happy? Is my child being abused again? Are the new parents able to protect their child, in my child, in a way that I didn't protect my child? Can they love how my child looks and acts? I had lots of fantasies about what kind of a parent I was going to be. I lost all those fantasies. Is my child still on my family tree? Does my child still get to contribute to the family now that they're part of another family? How will other people now view me? Do I have my same sense of worth in my family, in my community, in my culture? I'm no longer part of the norm. And I lost all kinds of power and privacy. And I really want to reflect here on what this means for the birth first father, who may be told about this child or not named and never even have an opportunity to step forward and offer to parent if the birth first mother isn't able to. May not see themselves ever in the role of a father. They've lost that social role in their child's life. They may have had poor advice. They may be fearful to step forward. And do other members of the constellation see me with any empathy? Or have I lost, all of that as well? What are the horrible things that are said about me to my child in the family that's parenting them? So much loss. And these losses live in their mind, constantly worrying. What are other people thinking about me? What happened? Why did this happen? What's wrong with me? It lives in my heart all the time. My heart hurts. My heart aches for that lack of connection. And it lives in my body. Where do birth first parents feel it? I remember years ago listening to a woman who said that she literally felt her body turning to stone. And she ended up with kidney stones and gallstones. She really was aware that her body was turning to stone because she'd done such a terrible thing. She became more and more rigid in the world, more and more fearful in the world. So what can we do for our birth first parents? Well, really, we want them to be able to make a loss inventory from the time they were being carried, from the time they were being birthed. What was their pregnancy like? What did they inherit? What do they remember in their body? What do they naturally know? What's brought them? It helps them to build their story for healing. What brought them to this place in their life? And we do want to help them to understand what they've lost and how they carry that in their body. And what have they learned from these losses? How do they feel about themselves, others, and the world? Remember that if they didn't get good attachment skills, they haven't learned to trust. And if they haven't learned to trust, they have minimal conscience development. They have trouble with cause and effect, which is why they don't show up at court. It's why they don't believe that the courts are going to terminate their rights. If they're attachment challenged, they actually may not be able to put together that if this happens, this is going to happen. It comes as a major surprise to them. And they need a lot of expressive outlets because so much of their loss is pre-verbal. Rejection. I want to go back for just 1 second and just mention that, Allison covered the 3 types of losses beautifully. And, that vicarious loss comes up and gets carried by them into the community. They often appear angry. They often reject others so they don't get rejected. They may carry that vicarious loss into their future relationships because they're angry and hurt and afraid, and they may carry them into their future parenting experiences. So without an opportunity to heal, those vicarious losses get unpacked in future relationships that come up as opportunities for them. So they seem to go from relationship to relationship to relationship because they can't sustain them with their attachment challenges and the vicarious losses that they carry. Their ambiguous losses come up because they're sad and angry, and they want their children to be loved and safe. And I frequently see this coming up whenever there's any kind of natural disaster or human disasters. I can't tell you how many phone calls I got after 9/11, particularly since we did have a family on a plane that went down in Pennsylvania, and there was a 3-year-old child that was killed. But the truth is, anytime something's happening, if they don't have any connection to where their children are growing up, they're going to wonder, is my child dead? Is my child drowning? Was my child in that tornado? Was my child in that schoolhouse? Was my child in that earthquake? And every day, every second, secondary losses. Seeing children with their parents in a park is a secondary loss. Anybody who asks them, how many children do you have? Are you a parent? Such a normal question that people get asked. And I've often said, some of you have heard me say this before, but if you want to get an accurate response from somebody as a social worker, as a therapist, you don't ask how many children you have. You ask, how many children have you had? How many children have you had? Which is a very different answer. So this feeling of being less than, not being good enough, having gone through a degradation ceremony in court, is a constant feeling of, I've been rejected and I deserve to be rejected again. They're often suspicious of the very openness that families may offer. Why would they do that? And when you think about it, in order to build a court case, all we gather is the negatives for the judge to help make a decision. And that's what the receiving family may hear. They may get a very, very limited understanding of who that birth first family is, birth mother and birth father, in the reports that you write in your presentation for a possible placement to a family. Unless we take the time to put in that they're very quick-witted, they have a great sense of humor, they have a weird sense of humor, they made you laugh, they had a great smile, had a great baritone to his voice, he was very commanding, had a great sense of style, may not have been educated, but had a lot of wisdom, showed their vulnerabilities, cried when thinking about or talking about their children. All that needs to go in there too. It humanizes them to the families. Because one of the things that most birth first families experience is that sense of they must hate me and my child must hate me. Because after all, I hate myself. I hate myself. So there's a tremendous belief that if anybody really knew who I was, they would reject me. And I have a little story I want to read you. This was actually an individual that called me several years ago while I was in private practice. I just want to read it, and it's from page 66 in our book. So it's right there for you. An older woman who remained anonymous through 3 lengthy phone calls, shared that she was going to kill herself because a daughter whom she'd relinquished as a newborn had recently contacted her. She'd never shared with anyone that she'd given birth to a baby at the age of 22 and placed her for adoption. Now, I know most of you are not working with this age group, but think about how much bigger this is for those folks who had 1 child, 2 children, 3 children removed from them through the courts. She never shared the details of this event with her husband or her subsequent children or grandchildren. In addition, as a bank manager, she had signed a morals clause and believed that she would be seen as a liar and an irresponsible woman if people knew the truth. Her fear of rejection led her to believe that if the truth was revealed, she would lose everything that was important to her, her husband, her family, and her career. The impact of her cumulative fear of rejection climaxed at the moment her daughter contacted her. 2 years of therapeutic support eventually allowed her to share her deeply hidden secret with her husband and family, and to eventually begin to build a relationship with her daughter. Of course, none of her deepest fears of rejection happened. Think about what it feels like, that if people know the truth, I will be rejected by my religion, by God, by my whole family, by future loves, future families. If anybody really knows who I am, why would they want to have a connection to me? So I wonder all the time what other people think of me. I really don't belong anywhere. And I'm going to add the word safely. I don't really belong anywhere safely because I'm so bad. I fear rejection from my child, my family, my peers, and the adoptive family. I feel rejected by the other first birth parent. I reject myself for being irresponsible, for making poor choices. I feel rejected by God, by my faith. I'm undeserving of the love, of having a partner, of having future children. This is why the healing is so important. Who is in their circles of belonging? Who do they belong to? Remember last time we talked about the kinship circle for our kids, who belongs to them? Who do our birth first parents belong to, and who belongs to them? Often they're alone. And they often keep it that way on purpose to defend against any future loss. So they set up rejection very often. It's important for them to think about their biggest fears. Who has rejected to them? How do they reject themselves? How would they really know if other people were rejecting them? And I think the biggest issue here, and we're going to talk about it, is who can they get attached to? How can they learn their skills? They carry tremendous shame and guilt, and Allison did a phenomenal job in explaining the difference between the two, just reminding you that shame is an outside-in emotion. It's about our being. Guilt is about our doing. Guilt doesn't even come about without attachment, trust, and conscience development. So when we get really angry at our birth first parents for lying about things, for telling us untruths, we may want to look at their history and see whether that's even a skill that they present. Empathy towards people who have minimal skills around conscience development. If you think about the labels, and I love that Allison touched on that stereotyping and stigmatizing and labeling that keeps them locked into shame and feelings of guilt. Birth first fathers as being seen as uncaring, just simply sperm donors, slam bam, thank you ma'am, philanderers, addicts, abusers, gang members, rapists, violent, a threat. They're seen as threats to maybe stopping the legal process of an adoption. They're seen as threats, not 50% of our children's gene pool, not of having something to offer as genetic parents. Our birth first mothers are seen as addicts and abusers, uneducated, mentally ill, uncaring, homeless, undependable, and promiscuous. That's still the labels. Those labels have been around since I've been teaching in the 60s. As Allison said, they haven't changed very much. All of this shame and guilt creates self-blame and self-loathing and impacts our 4 pillars of self-esteem. Remember, we talked about this last time, the 4 pillars of self-esteem. I'm afraid to say that our birth first parents frequently feel that their uniqueness is that they've lost a child, that they weren't good enough parents. They wear those labels as their form of uniqueness. They have very few role models. How do we bring to our birth first parents role models of individuals who lost their children to the system because of their lack of skill and their dependency on things to numb their pain, who've managed to heal and are being successful in the world? Where do we bring them in this process? How do we provide healing role models for our birth first parents? It's a huge challenge for our social work community, our therapeutic community. Who are their connections? We've broken so many connections. They've broken, and they continue to break. Did they have any really solid connections in their past? Can they see themselves being connected to people in the future? Doesn't that require teaching them some attachment skills? Don't they need one committed, loving adult to help them to heal? Who will that person be? And do they have any sense of belonging? Think of that circle that I just showed you. Any sense of belonging. Who are their clan, their people? Who would they say are the folks they can go to when they're feeling most vulnerable? Who do they go to? So obviously their self-esteem is greatly diminished. You know, since guilt helps us to become aware of our impact on other people, they carry a tremendous amount of guilt because they've been unable to care for, feed, and home their children. They have a lot of guilt. They've been unable to care for, feed, home their children. They feel guilt for not knowing how to parent. I did my best. I tried. Remember, they're drawing from an empty well. They feel guilt for not saving their children from the pain and distress or harm that they experienced. And they feel guilt that they could not complete the court's requirement, either at all or on time. Because the courts and the laws timeframes are so different often than what it takes for them to learn the skills. And kids can't wait forever for permanency, because we talked about that last month. So they have tremendous shame and guilt for placing or losing a child, for their children being harmed. It was my fault. Why didn't I protect my child? And other people do it when they're poor. Other people do it when they're single. These are the same questions their kids are going to ask. Other parents were poor. Other parents had addictions. Other parents had mental illness. Why did I have to lose my parents? And those are the same questions that the birth first parents are asking. I'm a failure. I'm a failure. I've caused other people pain. Not just me, not just the other birth first parent, not just my children, my whole extended family. Now, all of these are in the back of our book, but I'm going to say that these are wonderful tools. We do need to help them to address their toxic stress. We have to help them with their addictions and their mental illness. We have to do all that. But first, we have to give them what they didn't get when they were children. And that's a community issue that Allison so wisely explained, and I'm going to remind you of as we get there. You know, they don't know how to nurture themselves. They don't know how to play. They don't know how to be silly. They weren't kids. Many of them had such difficult beginnings in life. They didn't learn these skills. They don't know when you're telling a joke, or they think that you're actually teasing them, rejecting them, putting them down. They're not very good reading our sarcasm, our irony, our playfulness. They misinterpret consistently what we're saying and doing. So we have to be non-judgmental. We have to be clear. We have to say, I don't mean for you to hear it this way. This is my message to you, and we need to say it as simply and non-jargony as we possibly can. And they need to be connected to support groups of other folks who have experienced their same life experience, not just losing their children, their same life experience. I know that Concern United Birth Parents is really geared towards those folks who relinquish children voluntarily, who, by the way, have almost exactly the same issues. But many of them did have better earlier life experiences. So they've got more tools to address the pain, the shame. They did have some attachment They are in a position to make a life decision. That's what sets them apart, is they come to us with more skills. It doesn't mean they don't have the same losses, the same feelings and fear of rejection, the same hit on their self-esteem, the same issues of shame and guilt. I read an article yesterday about the fact that for many of our birth first parents, compliments set off vicarious trauma. How could you say that about me? You're wrong. That's not who I am. You're not recognizing who I really am if you give me a compliment. Sometimes they can have really strong reactions to something positive that we say. These are tough, complicated clients. And yet they're so often not really seen as an important part of this process. If we can heal them, we're bringing to our children healed first birth parents, which they are going to need. That's why we need to be invested in this. This loss has to be grieved. And often how they are grieving is disappearing, not showing up for services, living with their anger and depression, getting lost in their addictions. You know, Allison mentioned anticipatory grief. I don't know how many of them really have anticipatory grief because they're in denial that it's going to happen. And then it hits them in such a profound way. And their defense is anger. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to get my kids anyway. That rage is connected to deep, deep grief. And as Allison said, we often don't allow people to grieve in our society. It's unrecognized. You caused it, and they know that. You caused it. You have no right to grieve. What are you hurting for? Punishment, rather than grief, becomes the reaction. Self-punishment, or believing that I need to be punished by others. They will stay in grief, in addiction, in anger for the rest of their lives without treatment. They are stuck here. They can't move on. They have terrible dreams, nightmares, really. They have lots of nightmares. They may even hallucinate, and they may cut, and they may have suicidal attempts. They may throw caution to the wind and not care if they die. So they live in anger and denial. They have a physical longing for their children, which is what brings around the nightmares and the hallucinations. They experience a great deal of abandonment and aloneness, and their shame blocks their grief work. And they may actually rely on what I call act as if behaviors. They may put on false identities. You may see somebody who literally is going through life knowing inside that they're one person, but displaying another, which then brings them to a lot of false intimacy and fear of being discovered for who they are. So they do a lot of acting as if. to try to fit in with society, with fear all the time that they'll be discovered. And I want to say that openness is one way to address this. You know, I'm a great believer in keeping connections for children, making all of this about addition and not subtraction. But asking families to work with folks who don't have the skills is problematic. That's where we fall down as a community. We want those families to get the healing that they need so that the parenting parents, whether they're foster kin or adoptive, are not afraid to have a connection to those folks. They learn the boundaries to create those connections in a healthy way. But on the flip side, let me tell you that openness is no easy journey at all for our birth first parents. It is painful. It is painful to watch your children love other folks. It is painful to see them run to them when they're afraid or they're hungry or they're looking for permission for something. This is not easy for them. And if they don't have the skills, why wouldn't they disappear? It's not easy. They have to confront their grief. We see the benefits for the child, but it isn't easy for the receiving family, and it isn't easy for the family that's not parenting, who's the genetic family. There's resentfulness and anger and pain. And I mentioned this book, I think last time, I'm going to mention it again, but if you want to look at somebody talking about it, Amy Seek, S-E-E-K, her book on God in Jetfire. Now, this is a voluntary placement with somebody who does have life skills. And I want you to look at how painful it is for her. So imagine what it's like for people who don't have the skills. Where are they putting their grief? Who's holding them through their waves of emotion, their memories? Who's there for them when they're yearning and they're hurting? Who's doing the reparative work from the ruptures that have occurred? How do they get to where they need to go in their grief process if the community is not providing it? An unrepaired rupture is going to eventually impact the child caught in the middle of these families. And who prepares them and supports them during their anniversary reactions, the child's birthdays, the court degradation ceremony, Mother's Day, Father's Day? Who's going to be there for them at Christmas time and Easter? Any holidays where we come closer to our children. And remember that they are going to idealize their children and minimize themselves. Reminder of Tear Soup. Great resource, even for our birth first parents, about what it takes to grieve. Reminder of our Wheel of Emotion that we talked about in terms of helping children develop the language of emotion, develop some emotional IQ. Our birth first parents often don't even have that central circle: mad, sad, scared, joyful, powerful, and peaceful. They may not even have those words in their vocabulary. We may have to start at the very beginning because they didn't get what they needed as children. We have to provide them the language. The learning of the language of emotion, which comes from our attachment So I'm going to skip through these because I want to give us some, and you've got them from last time and you're getting them again. But they need to be able to talk about what they've lost, how that feels, how that comes out in their body, and how people grieve. How do you know you're grieving? How do you know you're even grieving? What are the words connected to grief? What rituals can we use? And identity. The big question is, who am I now? Who am I now? Somebody, am I still a mother or a father if I don't have my kids with me every day? Who am I now? Do I have the right to parent again? If I've been deemed an unfit parent, can I marry and have children in the future? Helping people to see that what happened to them is not them is part of identity building. What happened to you is not you. Let's look at what happened to you and why that happened to you. And who is the you behind those life experiences? And who could you become in the future? They have no hope. They have no sense of who they could become. That's part of the identity piece that requires addressing and healing. Am I a mother? Am I a father? How do I integrate being a birth first mother, birth first father? What are the rules? What are the boundaries? Do I get pictures? Can I share pictures of my children with others? How do I answer questions about my role? Can that role be taken away in an instant if I do something wrong? What would I have to do wrong again to lose that role? So helping them to identify who they are, who they could become, giving them a sense of their future based on their attributes and their skills. And without attachment skills, with diminished attachment skills, with fears and vulnerabilities, without knowing who I am in this new state, what do I bring to a relationship? What do I offer a partner? As birth first parents, everybody has suffered a relational crisis. Everybody's suffered a relational crisis. And I just want to read another piece from our book, and then I'm going to wrap up. This is really a piece that Allison brought to the book, and I love sharing it with you. A letter from a birth first mother in prison. It was nice of you to come and see me on Friday, even though all I did was cry. But crying can say it all. How I feel. You asked how I feel. Suicidal. Cannot cope. More depressed. Not being able to just carry on. Knowing that my children are with other people. They are loving and caring and have responsibilities for my children, doing the things their mother should be doing for them. Not knowing whether my son is all right and if he needs any more medical treatment. Feeling really low. Crawling back into my shell. Not able to concentrate. Feels like all my insides have left me to be with my child. All my insides have left me to be with my child. Wondering if I'll ever see my children again, especially when they both get old enough to come looking, if they even do. Feels as if I'm growing weaker instead of growing stronger. Thoughts about next month. Do not want the anniversary to come at all. Wondering what will happen when I get out of here, whether it's safe or not. My past is haunting me and I cannot get it out of my head. still not been able to come to terms with anything that has happened to me, suffering badly, feeling badly damaged on the inside. Nightmares are coming back to me because I'm having sleepless nights again, wishing that I could have done things differently. Guilty. Guilty. That says it all. That encompasses everything that we're offering here for you to think about. And the way intimacy gets displayed for our birth first parents is multiple surface relationships, going from relationship to relationship, but never being deeply involved. And any intimacy can be equated with loss. If I get too close, if I care too much, I'll lose this person as well. And I'm not really worthy of anybody really loving me. So I'm hurt, angry, overwhelmed, and easily triggered by closeness. It's all my fault. I fear true intimacy. I'm really not worthy. And I may confuse sex with intimacy. It may be that the only time I feel valuable is to be pregnant and have my kids leave me again. Form other families. Maybe that's my job in the world, to have really beautiful children and let other people raise them. That may be the identity that I take on, and the intimacy is connected to that. Intimacy is strengthened by a caring individual, consistently caring individual that gives you a hope for the future. So how do we address mastery and control? I don't know how we do it without building the skills. I don't know how we do it without building the skills. How do we make those steps when we have all these habitual behavioral systems that take us down roads that lead us further away from a healthy life? How do I do that? We need, and I'm speaking the big general we here as birth first parents, we need support. We needed it all the way through with an understanding that we didn't have the skills you were asking us to tap into, and we need it ongoingly for our children's sake and for the community's sake. We need to be seen as valuable people that didn't get what they needed. We need a supportive extended family, and they may be genetic or they may not be. We need mirror images that tell us what we can be in the future. We need other birth first parents who've achieved mastery. We need to be encompassed by adult adoptees and adoptive parents and foster parents and relative caregivers who see us as valuable and worthy of healing. We need to be treated with respect by judges and social workers and therapists. We need to be valued because we have great importance to our children. And who will they emulate if they see themselves more like us who've not healed? All systems have to understand attachment and ACEs and core issues. We need to have accessibility to medical, mental health, and recovery services. That means they have to be in our neighborhoods. We have to be able to get there. They have to be available, not just 9 to 5. They have to be people that are going to be there for the long run. I can't go through a series of losses with therapists over and over and over again. I need highly skilled, long time, committed folks who are going to know me and know me over time and make a deep commitment to me. So we need a network of supported programs. I wrote down the things that I wish every birth first parent could have. Non-judgmental, accepting, validating, kind, polite, respectful individuals who ask them, empower them, listen to them, make eye contact with them, and see them as human beings who are experiencing one of the worst life tragedies. I want somebody to ask them, what's it like to be you? And how can I help you? How can I help you? What's it like to be you, and how can I help you? Just a repeat of what Allison said. We have been doing things to them without asking what they need. Without asking what they need. So Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you for some question and answer. And I pray you got my passion about this. I am passionate about it. You can't heal one side of the constellation and ignore another.
And they're all interconnected. Thank you, Sharon. So I was mesmerized, as I hope you guys were as you're listening to Sharon. And we're just going to keep the Q&A questions up there and really invite your feedback, your comments, any questions you have. We're certainly open. I know we don't have too much time, but we can at least take the last 10 minutes and be open for your questions that Sharon and I are happy to receive and have a conversation about everything you just heard.
So I think the way that attendees have to do it is to raise their hand, and then I can make them a panelist if they want to ask a question. And again, you're welcome to post it in the chat as well, and we can just answer from there. So, oh, we just had a comment on there. All right, we have a question from Danya.
Are you reading that, Michaela? I'm sorry if I'm not following. I don't see the question.
Oh no, there. She raised her hand, so I asked to unmute, so she can go ahead and unmute herself.
And is that our Danya that I know?
Hi, Allison.
I was like, wait, I know Danya. Nice to see you, my dear.
Thank you for this training today. It was really informative, and it kind of touched my heart because my kids are, they've had their relationship with their first parent now for a couple of years, but recently, more so after COVID, in a sense that they were able to have more frequent visits, their birth mom kind of tends to rehash the past, about what happened in court when she lost custody, and it really impacted them so to where they, one of them especially, was crying when he got home. He just says, I don't even want to see her. It hurts too much. Yeah. So what advice would you or Sharon kind of give, like, in regards to that, as far as, I don't know if maybe I can give wise words to the birth mom because I have a relationship with her, or how do I help my kids? I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm happy to jump in. Sharon, you may have to stop screen share because we can still see your screen. So if you just go to stop share, we'll just all come back together, I think. Danya, what you just shared, the current example is really everything Sharon was just doing a deep dive around, the unacknowledged, unhealed pain and grief and loss. It's
Right.
actually why I think it's so important to build the relationship between the grown-ups, between you and the birth mother. Because you will have to circle back, and this is a common relational skill required for our parents, to circle back and have gentle and clear conversations about how children are affected by your unhealed pain. So there's a way to help the parent hear that you can still hear how painful this experience is for them. And hopefully there's some resources that can support their work, the birth parent's work, which needs to be done outside of the parent-child relationship. So what we often see is if our birth parents don't have the kind of support they need with their peers or inside of their clan or peeps or supportive networks, that these things aren't uncommon to be happening within and through the attachment with the child that was placed. And we do as parents have to put a boundary around that, and because it isn't best for the child to be the receiver of, again, that intergenerational absorption of an unhealed wound, which it could happen and does happen. So for me, and we talk a lot about this around open relationships, so we're thrilled you have an open relationship, but this is why boundaries, not walls, but boundaries are really important around some of these relationships, and that the grown-ups, when I say the grown-ups, maybe it's mom to birth mom, that we meet for coffee and have a nice talk that isn't just centered around this, but that this comes up and we set a nice boundary around how the child was impacted and how we can make sure the birth parent, the birth mother's getting the support she needs when her grief and loss surfaces over her lifespan. Because this is a perfect example of what does happen, Danya. This is really common scenario in openness, because grief and loss surfaces and is triggered vicariously, like as this child ages and she sees even maybe herself mirrored in this child at certain developmental stages, her triggers may be more outside of her awareness. So just kind of making sure we as the parent are having those parent-to-parent conversations outside of the child's ears, because this is where we're setting that boundary around how to move into having a more gentle and clear conversation about how this conversation impacted the child. And then having the parent hopefully be able to hear that with some additional resources or support. So we want to do it, of course, in a gentle way, but a really clear way, because we can't have ongoing conversations like that add so much toxic stress for the child, because they have a lot of big, often overwhelming feelings connected to this relationship, their core issues, right? So if you think about what we did last series, talking about all the child's core issues, in this lived moment with this birth mother, I'm getting her core issues triggering mine. It feels very distressing and overwhelming. So I hope that helps, and I want to make space for Sharon.
I was listening and thinking, and we have another big question here. The only thing I would add is that we have to be very careful as an adoptive family, all families, I'm just using that one type of family, that we don't use our children's distress as an excuse to shut down the openness, because our kids learn about their life experience developmentally, as we talked about last time, and each time a new awareness comes up for them, they're going to grieve. So if they're hurting, we have to support them in their grief process and not use it as an excuse to cut off that relationship. We have to make the boundaries clear, as Allison was explaining so well, but we also have to talk to our children about what's their issues and what's the birth first family issue, and that this is one of the reasons you're with us, is because your birth first parents are struggling with those issues. And you needed to be with us to learn how to deal with those issues, because they're still learning how to deal with those issues. But I always get fearful that somehow that's going to become the excuse to make them go away. So keep both those sides in mind. And we have time for one more big question there, Alice.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the question on the chat is, how do you address negative stigma of birth parents due to their abuse or neglect having their kid taken away from them? I've noticed foster adopted parents sometimes seem wary of them background and feel like birth parents are a negative influence on the foster adopted child or children.
What a great question, and it's true, I think, everywhere we go. So it's one of the more, I think, common challenges. I think the way you hear Sharon and I framing us as a culture and as a society, bringing much more humanity and backstory to something that doesn't have just a quick, like, oh, this is who birth parents are. That well before anyone becomes a birth first parent, there is a whole backstory to that life. And that things like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, have done a tremendous service, I think, to our birth first parent community. Because what we know is, what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. But we have to really reframe childhood trauma and neglect. And by the way, neglect is kind of the absence of attachment in the way you heard Sharon talking about it. So these skills that aren't learned have a significant impact, but the stigma that is, quote, kind of alive and well, all of us connected to the constellation, whether professionally or in a lived experience capacity, all have the ability, and I think we have to lead the charge around destigmatizing and not using those labels. Because by the way, sometimes I still hear inside child welfare, those labels being used, where, sometimes we still talk in that shorthand, and, my toenails curl a little bit where I'm like, we have to lead that destigmatization process, both for our children and for our birth family. So how we speak about a demographic, about a population that we're not members of. So think about the words and the phrases and how we frame that experience with compassion and dignity and a backstory, so we bring insight to it. I often see that as my role when I'm working with either foster or kinship or adoptive parents that don't have the lived experience of the birth first parent, to bring much more of the backstory around understanding and being sensitive to just how much trauma and childhood adversity their body, emotion, and mind state has absorbed. So we can just make space for more healing and potential for growth and learning and relationships. So for me, every barrier that comes up, like Danya was just saying, this barrier, this issue comes up, every one of those ruptures, every one of those issues is a pathway to deeper healing, both for the child, for the birth parent, and for us. That we look at all of these ruptures, all of these little like micro ruptures that occur within relationships as opportunities for us to do deeper healing, get to deeper insight around these relationships, and an ability to really hold space for especially our most stigmatized and vulnerable populations, like our children and our birth first parent community. So Sharon,
I would add, thanks, Allison. I would add that our children will feel that if you can't respect the people from whom they come, you never fully will respect and honor them. It will worry them. It will make you think, if you don't like them, there must be parts of me, since I come from them, that you don't like. And what's it going to take for you to reject me and decide that I'm not worthy of your love? So in accepting and loving the other, you are boosting the love and attachment to the children. And I think that's an important thing to teach our families.
Absolutely. Thank you both. We're at the end of our time right now, unfortunately, and we have one question left. So I'm just going to remind everyone before you go, our next session is going to be September 22nd. And during that training, we're going to be discussing 7 core issues in relationship to the adoptive, foster, resource, and kinship parents. So we hope to see you all there. It will be in the same format that you received this registration link. It'll be the same thing again for the next one. So be on the lookout for that email. We also are going to send out a follow-up email with a survey for you to take, as well as a sign-in sheet. So please fill that out. And then when you're finished, we'll send you the PowerPoint as well. They gave us permission to send that this time. So thank you all for coming. I know we are so fortunate and grateful to have Allison and Sharon here to share this information. It's such a wealth of knowledge that you're coming from. And I feel like we just learn so much every time we hear from you. So thank you again for being with us. And thank you all for joining us. If you don't mind, Sharon and Allison, to stick around just for a few more minutes for the last question that we have, and whoever else wants to hear it. Is that all right with you? Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and allow this person to ask their question.
Yay, we get a face
Oh, do we?
or a name. Maxon?
I don't see a
Yeah.
face.
I didn't know if you could see me. I don't even see the option of unblocking my video, but thank you so much. This was so helpful. I'm a social worker at an adoption agency. I also typed my question up, but I'll just say it. I'm the same person though. So I work at an adoption agency for in a state that has a 30-day revocation period, and I work with expected parents and birth parents. And one of the pieces that I struggle with is a lot of the resources that you gave are really helpful for long-term counseling, right? They're for like maybe a couple months or even years at kind of processing that grief. But what I'm constantly on the lookout for, and as we all know, there are so few resources out there. I love the idea of Tear Soup. I have the book and I forgot about it, so I'm including it, but I'm just, I focus on postpartum depression. I focus on how to survive the grief, but it's also, I'm always looking for how do we properly give the counseling and support while also knowing that birth parents are in this 30-day revocation period and being respectful and sensitive, but not being like, you're doing the right thing, because we don't know that. It is a voluntary placement with the population that I work with. So I'm always curious and would love to hear your thoughts, because that's always a balance that I'm trying to manage.
Boy, I'll tell you, that's the population I worked with for lots and lots of years. And I really feel for you. I love your sensitivity because you're asking the right question. And part of it is being able to not think of them as birth first parents. They're parents. And you have to remind them of that, that they're not birth first parents until that 30-day revocation is complete. And to remind them that their feelings are going to keep changing, that they may have other feelings in the hospital. I think you have to say to the other family, the possible receiving family, and you have to say it that way, that we don't know who's going to grieve and we don't know who's going to celebrate. And that's how it is until the day that it happens. And that we want to provide the least stressful, most joyful, most connecting trimesters between that mother and child, that what's happening is going to set up this child for a lifetime of feeling cared for and loved and wanted. And I used to go into some pretty deep discussions around what happens if the baby is born with a problem. What happens if, what specifically will you do? What would be a deal breaker if you're going to have an open adoption? I wouldn't do any adoptions today that weren't open anyway. That's how strongly I feel about it. But, what's going to be a deal breaker? What would the birth first family have to do that would cause the adoptive family to move the boundaries so far out that there was no visitation or contact? What would the adoptive parents have to do that would make the birth first parent feel incredibly scared and angry and betrayed? And I walk them through how all this is going to happen in detail. I do what's called a vision matching session. I want them to sit down and talk about what's their vision about how this is going to unfold, and at what point does the power shift, because the power is totally in the parent's arms until it's not. And so, really, those are so important, is that the empowerment of that mother and that father, if he's involved, hopefully he is, and recognizing that they're parents, that they're not birth parents. And I hate that we even name them that when they come into an agency. I don't know, Maxon, is that helping at all?
It is helping. Yeah, I think, to be honest, it's such a longer conversation, than this. It's like, I wish we could spend a day just like thinking of these resources and having more in this time where, you're right, they are parents, and we don't know what the best outcome is. We don't know if placing is the best outcome. We don't know if not is the best. And it's like, we have an assumption that it is sometimes because they're coming to an agency, but that's not always the right assumption. It's usually, we shouldn't have that. So Yeah, it is very helpful. Some of that I do, some of that I want to incorporate more. But yeah, it is. It's definitely something to continue.
And I will tell you that as long as you keep that clarity, that we don't have a crystal ball,
Yeah.
that nobody knows whether this is the right thing, that there may be regret.
Mm-hmm.
And can that parent live with any regret?
Mm-hmm.
Can that parent live with any regrets? I always used to say, if your knight in shining armor comes and picks you up tomorrow, or you win the lottery, will you be able to live with the decision that you're making today? Because this decision, when you sign these papers and the 30 days go by, this is forever. Even if the family you pick get a divorce, even if one of them dies, even if they go into bankruptcy, you know, even if they get on drugs, this is forever. And so, you know, the fact that you've got that clear in your head makes you an incredibly valuable social worker in that environment.
All right. Well, thank you for sticking around for that question. This has been so enlightening, and I just really appreciate this conversation about how we can support birth first parents afterwards as well, not just during and up into the point of termination. I agree with you, Sharon, that, you know, it's helpful not just for that parent, but for the child as well to continue to develop those relationships. So I think these conversations are important, and I hope that we're going to have more in the future as well. So thank you all again for being here. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you in September.
Thank you, Sharon and Allison.
And Cindy, when, you know, I need to talk to somebody about the parent presentation, because I don't want to wait till the last minute to be working on that.
Yes, Michaela and I will be reaching out to you. Absolutely. Yes.
Great. Just don't call me between June 4th and June 14th. My daughter will be here, and